The traveling show was falling apart when the cowboy spotted the cage. Inside, a hulking creature sat silent, matted fur, dead eyes, blood around the muzzle. $3 for the beast, the handler shouted. Laughter, mockery. The crowd parted as the cowboy stepped forward and dropped the coins. No one understood why he did it. No one cared. But when he opened the cage that night and the bear lifted its head to speak in broken English, the West would never be the same. What he thought was an act of mercy became the beginning of something far greater. The town of Bitter Mesa was holding its annual spring fair, the kind where dust clung to your teeth and the air smelled like sweat, horses, and hot lard. Beneath the canvas of creaking tents and drunken laughter, one corner of the gathering was quieter, like the wind had forgotten to blow there. A rusted cage sat half hidden in shadow. Most folks gave it a wide berth. Some laughed, others spit, but no one went close. Inside the cage slumped something that looked like a bear, or rather, what was left of one. Its fur was clumped with dried blood and desert grime. Flies buzzed around its snout. Thick iron rings clasped its wrists, and a heavy collar dug into his neck. The sign read, "The Killer Beast, $3 and it's yours." The man barking the offer was already drunk, leaning against a crooked cartwheel, swaying with each word. The crowd, a mix of cowhands and ranch wives, jeered without interest. No one wanted a dying bear, especially not one that hadn't moved in hours. And then the cowboy stepped forward. He wasn't dressed to impress, just trail dust on his boots and a worn duster jacket that had seen too many winters. His hat sat low on his brow, shadow in his eyes. He said nothing, just reached into his coat, pulled out $3 silver and tossed them into the dust at the handler's feet. A few laughs burst from the crowd. Someone muttered, "Fool's charity." The handler blinked, shrugged, and waved toward the cage like tossing away trash. "She's yours." The cowboy didn't flinch. He moved slow, careful, unholstering a bowie knife and cutting the rope knotted around the lock. The door creaked open with a sound that echoed louder than any gunshot. For a moment nothing happened, just the sun dipping lower and the wind picking up through the dry sage. Then the creature stirred. Not much, just the slightest turn of the head and two brown eyes, not beastly, but human, blinked at the light. The cowboy froze, not in fear, but recognition. This wasn't a bear. This was a man. Or rather, a boy. His face was smeared with dirt and bruises, but the line of his jaw and the way his fingers twitched said everything. He'd been gagged, beaten, and dressed in what scraps of hide the captors thought would make him pass for something animal, but his silence had fooled them all. The cowboy didn't say a word. He just stepped aside, letting the caged figure crawl forward into the sunlight, shielding his eyes. Behind them, the crowd had already lost interest. Another show, another sucker, but the wind that moved across the open plain whispered something else. The cowboy had just bought a secret, and the West was watching.
The ride back to the ranch was long and quiet. The cowboy had placed the frail figure on the back of his horse, tied loosely with a rope just for balance, not restraint. Every few minutes he glanced over his shoulder to make sure the boy hadn't fallen off, but the rider held steady, silent as the plains stretching around them. The sun was setting in ribbons of burnt gold and crimson, casting long shadows over the hills. Coyotes called in the distance, but neither man nor boy paid him any mind. By the time they reached the outskirts of the cowboy's land, night had fully settled in. The house was a modest one, wood faded from too many summers, porch steps creaking with age, a lone lantern flickering in the window. The cowboy didn't hesitate. He led the horse to the small corral, dismounted, and offered a hand. The boy flinched, not from fear, not anymore, but from the instinct bred by pain. Still, after a moment, he took it. Inside, the cowboy didn't ask questions. He didn't demand a name or story. He simply brought a basin of warm water, set it on the wooden table, and left the door cracked so moonlight could pour in. He laid out a clean blanket on the cot in the corner. The boy stood in the doorway for a long while, unsure, still half expecting a trick or a trap. His eyes, clearly functional now in the lamplight, scanned the room, wary but not wild. He could see, and the cowboy saw that he knew it. He didn't speak, just nodded once and poured another bowl of water for himself, settling in the other corner with an old journal he never actually read. The boy finally stepped inside. He moved slowly, like every limb hurt, and dipped his fingers into the basin. The water turned cloudy with dirt and blood. He scrubbed his face, peeled back the leather straps around his wrists, and for the first time in days, or perhaps weeks, exhaled something that wasn't fear. The night wore on. The cowboy kept his distance, not out of coldness, but respect. When the boy finally collapsed onto the cot, wrapped in the clean blanket, the cowboy pulled the lamp low and let the silence take over again. Outside, the wind rustled the dry grass and carried with it a peace that didn't need to be explained. Something had shifted. Not with words, not yet, but in the act of bringing him home, of treating him as human, the cowboy had planted something deeper than trust. He had given the boy dignity. And though no one saw it, though no medal was pinned or thanks spoken, that night marked the start of a bond built in silence, stronger than the rope that once bound the boy, stronger than any oath. It was a kindness the boy would never forget, and it was only the beginning.
The morning sun filtered through the gaps in the wooden slats of the cabin, painting golden stripes across the dusty floorboards. The smell of brewed coffee drifted into the small sleeping room where the young Apache lay wrapped in the blanket. He stirred, not in fear, but as if he had finally slept through a night without waking in panic. His bare feet touched the wooden floor, and he moved slowly toward the open doorway, squinting into the brightness of a new day. Outside, the cowboy was already at work. He was splitting wood near the barn, steady rhythm of the axe echoing through the stillness. A kettle sat over a fire, and beside it a pan of beans and a slab of cornbread wrapped in cloth. The boy said nothing. He stood on the edge of the porch, the blanket still over his shoulders, and watched the man work with the quiet concentration of someone who didn't want to disturb a fragile balance. When the cowboy finally noticed him, he didn't speak either. He simply nodded toward the pan and stepped aside. The boy moved to the fire, crouched, and began to eat slowly. His hands shook at first, not from fear, but from the strange luxury of safety. Every bite was careful, every movement thoughtful, as though he was still unsure this was real. As the sun climbed, the boy wandered the edges of the ranch. He walked past the barn, pausing at the well, running his fingers along the splintered wood of the fence rails. He touched the horse's mane gently, and the animal didn't flinch. He walked like someone testing the edges of his freedom, still expecting a leash to pull him back. The cowboy led him. He didn't follow, didn't question. He went about his tasks, oiling a saddle, checking fence posts, feeding the animals, but always kept the boy in the corner of his vision, just enough to ensure he wasn't in danger. At midday, they sat beneath the cottonwood tree together. The boy never looked the cowboy in the eye, but he no longer avoided him. They shared a meal in silence. The breeze carried the scent of dry sagebrush, and for a moment the ranch seemed like the only place in the world. But peace on the frontier was never guaranteed. As the sun dipped toward the western ridge, a flicker of movement caught the cowboy's eye. A small trail of dust rose along the far edge of the plain, faint but unmistakable. Riders. 2, maybe 3, moving slow, but with purpose. The cowboy narrowed his eyes and stood. He didn't say a word. He just moved toward the barn, his hand brushing the butt of the rifle leaning beside the door. The boy followed his gaze, and something shifted in his posture. Not fear, not anymore, but readiness. He turned back toward the cabin without being asked, ducking inside like he knew what danger looked like. The cowboy didn't panic. He didn't saddle a horse or run. He simply leaned against the porch post and watched the horizon, like a man who had faced trouble before and would face it again. That night, the lamps stayed low. The stars burned clear above the ranch, and somewhere out there, strangers were coming.
By mid-morning the next day, the sound of hooves stirred the dust at the far edge of the ranch. The cowboy had seen them coming long before they crossed the fence line. 3 riders, weather-beaten and grim-faced, moving not like wanderers, but like men following a scent. Their eyes scanned every inch of the land, too alert, too focused. These were not strangers lost on the trail. They were looking for something, or someone. The cowboy stepped down from the porch as they approached, his rifle resting nearby but not in his hands. He greeted them with a stillness honed over years. No warmth, but no threat. Just presence. A presence that said, "This is my land. Say your piece." The tallest of the riders, a man with a scar splitting his left eyebrow, swung down from his saddle and glanced around the yard. His boots crunched the dry dirt as he stepped forward, eyes narrowing on the empty cage that still stood beside the barn. "Funny thing," he muttered, loud enough for the cowboy to hear. "Heard a fella bought himself a wild one out in Coleridge. Paid $3 for it. They said it growled like a bear, but didn't bite." He paused, then added with a smirk that never touched his eyes, "Folks talk too much, but not always wrong." The cowboy didn't blink. He let the silence settle between them like a coiled snake. Behind the barn window, the Apache boy crouched low, watching. His heart pounded in his chest. He recognized the man, not by face, but by the way he moved. This was the kind of man who put cages around living things, the kind who didn't ask if they belonged there. The second rider dismounted and ran a hand along the wood of the cage. He made a show of inspecting the broken hinges, whistling low under his breath. "You break this open yourself, friend?" he asked. The cowboy's voice came quiet, dry as the earth. "Storm broke it. Wind tore the whole side loose." "Storm," the first man repeated, smiling now. "Mighty convenient." The third rider remained on his horse, silent, but his eyes never left the cabin. The cowboy noticed. He stepped forward, subtly blocking their line of sight, placing his broad frame between the men and the porch. "Ain't much here worth interest," he said. "No wild things, just me and the fence." The lead rider chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "See, I think maybe you're the kind of man who sees something caged and thinks it needs freedom, and maybe that's noble, or maybe it's stupid." He spat in the dirt. That thing was dangerous, not just to us, to everyone. You might have thought you were helping, but you don't know what you brought home. The cowboy didn't blink. His jaw tightened, and a sliver of heat passed through his eyes. Not anger, but decision. He'd heard enough. The riders mounted up again, but not before the leader leaned close and said, almost gently, "He comes back to us one way or another. One day, you'll see." They turned their horses and rode off slow, but not aimless. They were giving time, not giving up. As their silhouettes disappeared into the dusty horizon, the cowboy turned toward the cabin. He saw the curtain fall back into place. The boy had heard it all. The quiet returned, but it felt different, heavier, charged. That night, the cowboy brought his rifle inside, and the Apache boy did not sleep.
The morning came colder than expected. The cowboy rose before dawn, the fire in the stove already embers. He stoked it to life with practiced movements, his breath misting in the air as the room slowly filled with warmth. Outside, frost clung to the tips of dry grass like the final resistance of a long summer surrendering to winter. The boy was awake too, sitting near the hearth. He hadn't slept much. The tension of the rider's visit still lingered in the corners of the cabin, but he didn't speak. He just watched the flames as they stretched and curled upward like dancers trying to escape their stage. The cowboy set a bowl in front of him. Cornmeal, beans, and a bit of pork. Simple food, but shared silently, it felt like a ritual. like trust, served warm. After breakfast, the cowboy handed him a small axe and gestured toward the stack of wood behind the cabin. The boy hesitated, then followed. The axe was heavy in his hands, unfamiliar, but he learned. The cowboy didn't offer many corrections, only subtle shifts of posture, a nod of approval, a single glance when the blade bit clean. They spent hours like that, side by side, but mostly in silence. Occasionally, the cowboy would hand him a tool or motion toward the barn, and the boy would understand. They built a rhythm that required no speech. Each action was answered by another, like notes in a quiet song only they could hear. By noon, sweat clung to the brow's boy and dirt streaked his cheeks. He didn't mind. He was used to dirt, but this kind felt different. Not the filth of captivity, but the dust of labor, of something earned. Inside the barn, the cowboy showed him how to check the saddles, how to oil the leather, how to feed the horses properly. The boy mimicked his movements with careful precision. His hands were smaller, but his attention was sharp. He learned fast. Later, when the sun began its descent and painted the hills in copper and blood orange, the cowboy sat on the porch and whittled a small piece of wood. The boy sat nearby, not asking what he was making, just watching. The cowboy carved slowly, shaping something out of nothing, a figure, perhaps a horse or a man. It wasn't finished, but the shape was taking form. The boy stared at it for a long time before finally reaching into his own pocket and pulling out a strip of leather he'd knotted into a simple loop. He placed it on the porch, beside the cowboy's foot, an offering, a thank you. The cowboy didn't speak. He just nodded and kept carving. That night, before turning in, he moved the rifle from beside his bed to a hook by the door. Not out of reach, but no longer clutched. A quiet sign. And the boy slept, for the first time, deeply, not as a prisoner in hiding, but as someone home.
The morning broke unusually quiet. No wind, no bird call. The kind of silence that feels like the land itself is holding its breath. The cowboy stepped outside, cup of coffee in hand, and looked toward the distant ridge out past the cattle pens. A faint line of dust shimmered against the morning light. At first, he thought it might be a storm, but it moved too steadily, too purposefully. He didn't reach for his rifle. He simply waited. The boy came and stood beside him, his dark hair pulled back now, the scar on his cheek catching the rising sun. He watched too, and he didn't flinch. One rider came first, then 5, then a dozen, then more than 40. Apache warriors, moving as one, silent, proud. Dressed in earth tones and bone, their faces marked with war paint, but none raised a weapon. They stopped just short of the pasture and waited. Then a single older man dismounted. He approached slowly, his gaze moving between the cowboy and the boy. When he removed his headdress, even the horses seemed to shift in reverence. The boy took a single step forward, and in that instant, everything changed. The elder fell to one knee, not to the cowboy, but to the boy. The others followed, a sea of kneeling warriors under the golden sun. And the cowboy understood. He hadn't rescued a victim. He'd saved the son of a chief, believed to be lost, maybe even dead. The boy turned, walked back to the porch, and placed a single object into the cowboy's hand. A pendant carved from turquoise and elk bone, the mark of a protector. Not just a gesture, but a naming, a title. Gifts followed. Horses, blankets, tools, food, but none of it mattered more than what the cowboy saw in the boy's face. Not fear, not pain, but peace. He stood there, hat in hand, overwhelmed and silent. The warriors didn't stay long, just long enough to show their gratitude. The boy chose not to leave with them.
He stayed by the cabin, by the man who had offered him water, fire, and silence, and in doing so had offered him freedom. That evening, the cowboy didn't say much, but he set 2 plates at the table, 2 mugs, and poured the coffee evenly. Outside, the plains were quiet again, but it was no longer the hush of waiting. It was the stillness of something settled, of justice done, of kindness returned.